Something extraordinary just happened, something that every politician, every lobbyist, and every transit executive hoped you wouldn't notice. Zohran Mamdani walked into a room full of powerful transportation officials, billion-dollar consultants, and bureaucrats who haven't seen a subway ride in years, and he demanded something they consider unthinkable: $0 fares for the public. Free transit. A system that actually serves people instead of draining them. And the moment he said it, you could practically feel the panic ripple across the room. Because this isn't just a policy suggestion, it's a direct threat to a quiet, comfortable ecosystem of contracts, bonds, fair revenue projections, and political leverage. This is about power. This is about accountability. And this is about a politician daring to pull back the curtain on a system that has been squeezing working Americans for decades. The question now isn't, can we afford it? It's, why were we never allowed to ask? You could almost feel the air tighten. Zohran Mamdani wasn't yelling. He wasn't grandstanding. He simply leaned forward in his chair during the transit budget hearing, looked directly at the officials in front of him, executives who collectively oversee billions of dollars in public infrastructure, and asked a question so simple, so brutally obvious, that it landed like a grenade on the table. Why can't fares be zero? And in that moment, everything broke. Suddenly, the entire panel shifted. You could see the discomfort ripple through them like a physical vibration. Eyes darted downward. Papers were shuffled, the universal bureaucratic language for stalling. A few attempted polite smiles, the kind you give when someone brings up a topic everyone agreed beforehand to pretend doesn't exist. And then came the familiar phrases, the pre-packaged policy vocabulary, complex budgetary constraints, fare box recovery ratios, long-term capital obligations. None of it answered the question. All of it avoided it. Because Mamdani didn't ask for a spreadsheet. He didn't ask for projections. He asked about the philosophy of the system, the purpose of public transit. And that's the one place transit authorities never want the conversation to go. Why? Because the idea of $0 fares doesn't just challenge policy, it challenges power. It forces a room full of people who haven't ridden the subway without security escorts in years to justify why a working mother paying $2.90 a day should be the one holding up a multi-billion-dollar system. And the truth becomes uncomfortable fast. Around the world, entire countries have already made public transit free. Luxembourg, yes, an entire nation, eliminated fares. Tallinn, Estonia did it a decade ago. Kansas City tested it and saw results: higher ridership, stronger local economies, fewer barriers for job seekers. So no, the idea isn't radical. It isn't utopian. It isn't even new. It's just new to the people who benefit from the old way of doing things. Transit agencies in the US rely heavily on farebox revenue not because it works, but because decades of underfunding pushed them into a corner. Instead of governments funding transit like a public necessity, they treated it like a business franchise that must earn its keep. So politicians underfund it. Agencies scramble. Riders pay the difference. And once that cycle forms, it becomes the perfect shield. Every budget crisis becomes reason to raise fares. Every structural failure becomes rider responsibility. Every inefficiency becomes invisible under a mountain of consultant reports and bond obligations. So when Mamdani asks, why can't fares be $0? He's not just challenging the budget. He's ripping the mask off an entire ecosystem built on quiet assumptions. Assumptions that shift the burden downward while keeping accountability upward completely untouched. What makes his question so threatening is its clarity. It exposes the system's contradictions in a single sentence. If transit is a public good, why does it operate like a private business? If mobility is essential, why is it rationed by income? If other governments can fund free transit, why does the richest nation on earth claim it can't? People in power fear simple questions because they collapse decades of excuses. And suddenly, the room was forced to confront something they've avoided for years. Is transit for revenue, or for people? They know the answer. They just don't want to say it out loud. Because admitting it leads directly to the next, and far more dangerous, question. If fares aren't necessary, then who has been benefiting from keeping them in place? And that's where the real story begins. Let's talk about the part of the story transit executives pray you never bring up: the money. Because the moment you peel back that layer, the numbers, the budgets, the so-called fiscal realities, the whole house of cards starts wobbling. Here's the uncomfortable truth they never state plainly: farebox revenue doesn't even come close to covering the cost of running major transit systems. In cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, pick any of them, fares usually cover 30 to 40% of operating costs. Sometimes even less. Think about what that means. Even today, with fares being charged, taxpayers are already funding most of the system. So when an executive leans into the microphone and says, we need higher fares to survive, what they are really saying is, let the poorest riders pay for the inefficiencies we refuse to fix. And this is where the real game begins. Because running a transit agency has become less about delivering mobility and more about managing a maze of consulting contracts, bond agreements, and politically appointed board members who understand one thing very clearly: the more complicated the budget looks, the harder it is for the public to question where the money is going. Complexity isn't a flaw, it's a shield. Consultants thrive in it. Private contractors thrive in it. Bond issuers thrive in it. Career managers thrive in it. Everyone gets a slice, except the riders who actually need the service. So what do agencies do? They push a narrative built on fear. Without fare hikes, the entire system will collapse. It's the same script every time, delivered with the seriousness of a hostage situation. But this narrative hides something bigger: massive inefficiencies, bloated contracts, outdated equipment, and decades of political refusal to modernize revenue models. It's easier, much easier, to tell working families to pay an extra dollar than to confront why a single escalator repair can cost as much as a luxury car. It's easier to blame fare evasion than to explain why agencies sign multi-million-dollar contracts for technology no one actually uses. It's easier to call free transit unrealistic than to admit that Washington writes blank checks for highways, airports, and oil companies without blinking. Nobody asks, where will we find the money, when the Pentagon wants another $100 billion? But ask for buses to be free and suddenly we need a PowerPoint presentation, 6 feasibility studies, and a year of public hearings. And who pays the price for this double standard? Not the wealthy. They barely touch public transit. Not the board members. They expense everything. Not the lobbyists. They bill the hours. It's the riders. The single mom taking 2 buses to work. The student commuting to class. The minimum wage worker who already spends a painful share of their income on transportation. When fares go up, it's not just a budget adjustment, it's a tax on being poor. And here's the quiet truth Mamdani is exposing: free transit doesn't remove the need for funding, it removes the excuse to avoid funding it. It forces politicians to finally do the job they've avoided for decades: properly invest in the public systems people rely on every single day. Because when you strip away the fear narrative, the math becomes embarrassingly simple. America can afford free transit. What it can't afford is accountability. And that's the part executives and politicians fear most, because if the public ever starts questioning where the money actually goes, the next chapter of the story gets even more uncomfortable for them. Before we even talk numbers, let's start with the question at the center of all of this: is mobility a right or a luxury? Because if you believe public transit is just a service, something optional, something you use only if you choose not to drive, then yes, the whole conversation becomes abstract. But if you believe that movement, access, opportunity, and the basic ability to get from home to school, to work, to a doctor's appointment, are fundamental to human dignity, then the debate shifts completely. Transit isn't optional for millions of Americans, it's survival. And when you make survival expensive, everything else becomes harder. Think about what happens in a city like New York. A typical rider easily spends $1,500 to $2,000 a year on fares. That's not a small number. That's a month of rent in many neighborhoods, or groceries for an entire family. For a working-class household, it's brutal. But for an executive who doesn't even take the train, it's nothing. And that's the point. The cost hits those with the least, the hardest. There are students who skip internships because they can't afford the commute. There are job seekers who turn down opportunities across town because a daily fare becomes a monthly burden. There are elderly passengers who ration their trips, literally ration movement, because they fear wasting money on non-essential travel. When a city makes every train ride feel like a financial decision, it traps people in invisible cages. It punishes ambition. It tightens the walls around neighborhoods. It turns mobility into a form of economic gatekeeping. Now let's talk economics, the part policymakers pretend to care about. Free transit isn't charity. It's a catalyst. Cities that experimented with free public transit saw higher ridership, stronger local spending, and in many cases, reduced congestion because fewer people had to rely on cars. Studies from places like Tallinn and Luxembourg show lower emissions, more job seekers entering the workforce, increased economic circulation because people move more freely, greater foot traffic in business districts. Mobility fuels the economy, literally. When people move, money moves. Here's where the populist truth really hits: corporations get subsidies, banks get bailouts, developers get tax breaks, but the working class, they get fare hikes. Where is the fairness in that equation? We subsidize wealth constantly. It's built into the policy structure of America. But the moment you suggest subsidizing everyday people through something as simple as getting them to work without draining their wallets, the political class panics. Suddenly it's unaffordable. Suddenly it's unrealistic. Suddenly we're told that the richest nation in human history can't figure out the math. But here's the emotional core. Transit is not about convenience. It's about dignity. It's about the single mother who has to take 2 buses to drop off her kid before going to work. It's about the immigrant worker navigating 3 train transfers at 5 a.m. It's about the elderly man who relies on the bus to pick up medication.
For them, transit isn't an option. It's a lifeline.
And that's why $0 fares matter.
Not because it's trendy, not because it sounds good,
but because it redefines transit the way it always should have been defined, as a public investment in human potential. Free transit doesn't mean free rides.
It means a freer society.
And if the moral and economic case is this clear, then you have to ask, why are the people in power fighting it so hard? If money were the only issue, this debate would have been solved years ago.
But it's not.
And this is where the real story begins, not in the budgets, or the fare charts, or the accounting spreadsheets, but in something far more powerful.
Control.
Because for decades, the fare system hasn't just been a way to collect revenue. It's been a tool that gives transit agencies leverage over riders, data over communities, and a convenient shield against political accountability. Let's start with one uncomfortable truth. Every swipe, tap, or fare payment generates data. Where you go, how often, at what times, and on which routes. Agencies use it, sell it, analyze it, and justify everything from service cuts to policing strategies with it. Remove fares, and suddenly the entire surveillance ecosystem tied to transit begins to collapse.
Look at what else vanishes.
The turnstile contracts, multi-million-dollar deals to install, maintain, upgrade, and secure fare gates. A policing models, whole squads of officers assigned primarily to watch for fare evasion, not public safety. A private security budgets, companies hired to patrol stations, check tickets, and handle enforcement. A software vendors, systems that track payments, verify passes, and build behavioral profiles.
This is not a small industry.
It's a web, a very profitable one, wrapped around the simple act of getting on a train. So when Mamdani demands $0 fares, he's not just threatening the budget.
He's threatening the ecosystem built around enforcing the budget.
And here's the political twist. The moment fares disappear, the blame shifts upward. Today, transit agencies can always point fingers downward. You didn't pay your fare. You evaded. You're draining the system. But with no fares to police, no turnstiles to justify, and no revenue to pretend is keeping the lights on, the heat finally moves where it belongs, to the politicians who underfund transit. Without fares, agencies can't say, "We don't have the money." They'd have to say, "Lawmakers refuse to give it to us." And that's the one sentence bureaucracies have spent decades avoiding. Because fare debates create the perfect smokescreen. Higher fares mean more revenue.
More revenue means fewer questions.
Fewer questions mean more comfort. More comfort means the hierarchy stays intact. This is why free transit movements around the world, from Estonia to Brazil to US pilot cities, meet political resistance not because the policy is impossible, but because it disrupts these comfortable hierarchies.
Elites fear losing influence. Agencies fear losing control. Contractors fear losing revenue.
Police fear losing a justification for enforcement. Meanwhile, riders, the people who actually depend on the system, fear losing something very different: access.
For them, the stakes aren't political.
They are personal. A missed bus isn't an inconvenience, it's a missed shift. A delayed train isn't a nuisance, it's a lost paycheck. A fare hike isn't a number, it's a burden. And when those two fears collide, the elite's fear of losing power and the public's fear of losing access, you get the exact storm we're watching play out right now.
What happens next isn't just about buses or trains.
It's about a deeper question, one that shakes the foundation of American public life. To understand what's really at stake here, we have to zoom out, far beyond transit, beyond fares, beyond agencies and hearings. Because free transit isn't just a transportation argument. It's part of a much larger, older, and far more defining debate. What does a government owe its people? And what does it mean to live in a society that claims to value the public good? Look at the institutions we now take for granted: public schools,
public libraries, public parks, community colleges.
Each one of them, at the time of creation, was attacked with the same line we hear today: we can't afford it. It's unrealistic. It will destroy the economy. And yet, those public goods became foundational, not because they were cheap, but because they were necessary. Societies don't collapse when they invest in people. They collapse when they refuse to. So the question becomes, how did we reach a point where America, the wealthiest nation in recorded history, can spend trillions on wars, corporate bailouts, and tax loopholes for the ultra-rich, but somehow claims that making a bus free is where the financial line must be drawn? Where is this selective frugality coming from? Because if you peel back the political branding, you find a country with money for everything except the things that directly improve everyday lives. And that's not an economic strategy, it's an ideological choice. This leads us to the deeper conflict, one that doesn't appear on budget charts or transit maps. Are we a society built on shared infrastructure, or are we a society that forces individuals to survive alone? Free transit threatens an ideology that has shaped American policy for decades, the belief that anything public should be minimized, privatized, or turned into a product. Mamdani's push for $0 fares is threatening not because it's expensive, but because it reopens a door that political elites have tried to weld shut, the door to a renewed public sphere.
His demand becomes symbolic.
He's not just challenging transit fares, he's challenging a worldview that insists people should pay, and pay again, and keep paying, just to exist inside their own city. When you strip away the economics, this is a battle about dignity,
About mobility. About fairness.
about whether a parent should be punished financially for taking their kid to school,
Whether a worker should be taxed by the mile for the crime of trying to earn a paycheck.
whether a student should have to calculate if they can afford to attend an internship that changes their future. And when you see this fight clearly, without the bureaucratic fog, you realize how simple the question actually is.
Do we still believe the public deserves anything in return for the taxes it pays?
Or has the idea of public benefit become so controversial, so radical, that even a free bus ride is now treated like a threat to national security? Because make no mistake, this debate isn't ending with one hearing or one proposal. What Mamdani sparked is the beginning of a much bigger national conversation about power, priorities, and what a modern democracy should look like. And if free transit is the opening question, then the next questions become even harder for the political establishment to answer. This battle isn't over.
It's only just getting started.